The courtroom buzzed with the usual air of anticipation. Lawyers shuffled through documents, spectators murmured in subdued tones, and somewhere in the distance, a gavel struck in another chamber. Judge Eleanor Hayes occupied her seat at the bench, her expression composed and professional. It was another day, another case, or so she believed. The bailiff called the case, the State of Louisiana versus James Anderson. Eleanor adjusted slightly in her seat, her hands resting on the smooth oak of the bench. She glanced at the charges before her. Assault, robbery, and resisting arrest. A familiar pang of disappointment settled in her chest. Another lost soul ensnared in the system, she thought. When the defendant was brought in, her world shifted. The man standing before her, shackled at the wrists and ankles, was not a stranger. He was James Anderson, her James. Her throat constricted as a wave of memories flooded back. Summer afternoons spent racing bicycles down the dusty streets of Hammond, Louisiana, late-night conversations beneath the magnolia tree in her backyard, the promises they made as children to always support one another regardless of circumstances. But the man before her was not the boy she remembered. His shoulders slumped, his face etched with years of struggle, yet his eyes, those deep, soulful eyes, were unmistakable. Eleanor's grip on the gavel faltered. For the first time in her career, she hesitated. The room felt smaller, the walls closing in as she grappled with the inconceivable. James looked up, a blend of shock and resignation on his face. Recognition flickered in his eyes. But he quickly averted his gaze, bowing his head slightly. The courtroom held its breath. Eleanor forced herself to speak. "Mr. Anderson, you stand accused of assault and robbery. How do you plead?" James's voice was rough, nearly unrecognizable. "Not guilty, Your Honor." Her heart raced. She wanted to halt everything, to demand answers. What had happened to him? How had their paths diverged so drastically? But her role as a judge required her to remain composed. "Proceed," she stated, her voice steadier than she felt, as the prosecutor began their opening remarks. Eleanor's mind raced. This was not just another case. This was James. Somehow, she had to find a way to separate her past from her present before it was too late. The courtroom faded as Eleanor's thoughts drifted to a time long before her black robes and the gavel in her hand. She and James had grown up on different sides of Hammond, Louisiana, separated not by distance, but by the unspoken barriers of their segregated town. Her family lived in a modest one-story home with a white picket fence, while James's family resided in a weathered house at the end of a dirt road, surrounded by fields. Their friendship had been rare. She recalled how they met, an accidental meeting at the edge of a creek where she had wandered too far from her own yard. James had been fishing, his line tangled in the reeds. She had offered to help, and that simple act had blossomed into years of secret adventures and shared dreams. "Eleanor," he had once said, lying beside her on the grass under the stars, "ever thought about leaving this place? Like really getting out? Going somewhere people don't look at us funny just for sitting together?" She had laughed then, dismissing the idea. But James was not joking. Even as a child, he perceived the world for what it was. A place that didn't always welcome people like him. Their bond deepened despite the whispers, the sidelong glances, and the outright disapproval from both sides. But the pressure was always there, a weight neither could shake. Then one day, it all came crashing down. It was the summer before high school, when Eleanor's father caught them sitting together on the porch. His voice had been cold, sharp with authority. "Eleanor, get inside now." She hesitated, glancing at James, who stood frozen. "Go on," he said quietly, his voice laced with resignation. "I'll see you around." But they hadn't seen each other again. Not really. Her father forbade her from seeing James, and shortly thereafter, his family moved away. Eleanor immersed herself in her studies, her ambitions pulling her far beyond Hammond. She attended law school, pursuing dreams of justice and fairness, but she never forgot the boy who had shown her what courage looked like. Now, sitting on the bench, she wondered what had become of James after she had walked into that house and closed the door on their friendship. His record reflected a series of arrests for minor offenses, petty theft, loitering. Nothing that indicated a violent nature, but how much of a life could be captured in a few lines on a rap sheet? The prosecutor's voice snapped her back to reality. He detailed the alleged crime. James was accused of assaulting a store clerk during a robbery at a convenience store in Baton Rouge. The clerk had sustained minor injuries, and the cash register had been emptied. James was apprehended a few blocks away, the cash reportedly still in his possession. Eleanor observed James as the prosecutor spoke. His posture was slouched, his hands clasped in front of him, but his expression was unreadable. Did he actually do it? Or was there more to the story than what the prosecution asserted? The courtroom adjourned for a lunch break, affording Eleanor a moment to collect her thoughts. Upon returning to her chambers, her assistant, Margaret, approached with a tentative expression. "Judge Hayes, are you okay? You seem a bit distracted," Margaret asked. Eleanor hesitated. Should she confide in Margaret? Would it be unprofessional to admit that she knew the defendant? Instead, she shook her head. "I'm fine, just a lot on my mind." But she wasn't fine. How could she be when the past she had buried so deeply was sitting just a few feet away, awaiting her judgment? The courtroom filled again when the trial resumed. Reporters scribbled notes, the clerk shuffled papers, and the prosecutor, a sharp-faced man named Richard Powell, was ready to present his case. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Powell began, his voice confident, "this case is about violence. It's about a man who entered a convenience store and, without provocation, assaulted an innocent clerk before stealing the cash register contents. The evidence will prove that James Anderson is guilty of this crime." Eleanor felt a knot tighten in her stomach. The prosecutor's tone was clinical, detached, as if James were merely a name on a list. She glanced at James, whose gaze remained fixed on the table before him. The defense attorney, Lisa Porter, rose to deliver her opening statement. Young, but assured, her voice resonated across the room. "The prosecution would have you think this case is straightforward, but it is not. My client, James Anderson, has proclaimed his innocence from the very beginning. We will demonstrate that there is more to this story, and that the assumptions made on the night of the arrest will not withstand scrutiny." The first witness took the stand, a store clerk who had been working during the incident. He recounted seeing a man matching James's description enter the store, argue with the cashier, and then leap over the counter. His testimony was detailed, but something about it felt rehearsed. Lisa's cross-examination was precise. "Mr. Chambers, you stated that the individual who attacked the clerk was wearing a red hoodie, correct?" "Yes," the witness replied. "Did you see his face clearly?" "Not really. It was dark, and he had the hood up." Lisa nodded, pacing slightly. "So you're saying you couldn't definitively identify the person who committed the assault?" "Light a day." "Well, no," he replied. "No further questions," Lisa said, interrupting him. Eleanor noticed James shift slightly in his seat, his posture straightening, as if the exchange had offered him a flicker of hope. The next piece of evidence was a surveillance video from the store. The footage was grainy and poorly lit, depicting a figure in a red hoodie entering the store. The prosecution argued that the individual in the video was James, but the quality made it hard to discern any defining features. As the video played, Eleanor scrutinized it closely. Could this really be James? The figure moved quickly, reaching for the counter before disappearing off screen. The footage ended abruptly, leaving an unsettling gap in the narrative. James's defense centered on an alibi. He claimed he had been walking home from a friend's house at the time of the robbery. However, the friend was unwilling to testify, citing fear of retaliation from the community. Lisa argued that the absence of a willing witness did not negate James's innocence, but the jury's expressions suggested skepticism. As the trial progressed, Eleanor felt the burden of her position bearing down on her. She was expected to be impartial, a beacon of fairness. But how could she be when every moment reminded her of their childhood? The boy who had once been her closest friend was now a man fighting for his freedom, and it was her responsibility to determine his fate. When the court adjourned for the day, Eleanor lingered at the bench, her fingers tracing the edges of the gavel. She yearned to speak to James, to ask him directly what had transpired, but she knew she couldn't. Any contact outside the courtroom would jeopardize the case and her career. Watching James being escorted out of the room in shackles, Eleanor's resolve faltered. She had always believed in the justice system, in its capacity to uncover the truth, but for the first time, she questioned if the truth was something it could ever truly grasp. The courtroom hummed with quiet conversations as the trial approached a crucial juncture. It was the defense's turn to present their case, and Lisa Porter called her first witness. Officer Daniel Harris, the arresting officer. Eleanor leaned forward slightly, her eyes narrowing. This was where the cracks, if any, might begin to emerge. Officer Harris, a stocky man with a gruff demeanor, took the stand. Lisa approached him with deliberate calm. "Officer Harris," she began, "you were the one who apprehended my client, correct?" "That's right," he replied, his tone curt. "You stated in your report that Mr. Anderson was walking 2 blocks from the robbery scene when you detained him. Is that correct?" "Yes." "What led you to believe he was the suspect?" Harris shifted in his seat. He matched the description. A black male in his mid-40s wearing dark clothing. Lisa raised her eyebrows. Dark clothing? But the suspect in the video was described as wearing a red hoodie. "Did you find a red hoodie in Mr. Anderson's possession when you searched him?" Harris hesitated. "No, but he could have discarded it." Lisa stepped closer. "Could have?" "Did you or any other officer search the surrounding area to locate this supposed hoodie?" Harris's jaw tightened. "No, we didn't have time. He was apprehended quickly." Lisa continued. "So to clarify, you arrested my client based on a vague description without any physical evidence linking him to the scene?" The officer's silence spoke volumes. Eleanor glanced at the jury. Several members exchanged uncertain looks. Lisa pressed further. "Officer Harris, do you recall if Mr. Anderson said anything at the time of his arrest?" He protested, said he was innocent. "Did you consider investigating his claim, or did you assume guilt solely based on his appearance?" Harris's face flushed. "I followed protocol." "Protocol?" Lisa echoed, her voice laced with skepticism. "No further questions, Your Honor." The courtroom buzzed once more as Harris stepped down, his credibility noticeably shaken. Eleanor's heart raced. This was more than just a trial now. It was a reckoning, not just for James, but for a system eager to condemn him. The defense's next move was surprising. Lisa introduced an expert witness, a forensic analyst who had examined the surveillance footage. The analyst explained that, based on the height and build of the person in the video, there was no conclusive way to confirm it was James. Moreover, the timestamp on the footage had been altered, raising questions about its validity. The prosecutor tried to dismiss the testimony as mere speculation, but the jury appeared unsettled. A shadow of doubt crept into the room, and Eleanor could sense its weight. As the day came to a close, James was given the chance to testify on his own behalf. Lisa had cautioned him about the risks, but James was determined as he approached the stand. Chains softly clinking. His voice, although quiet, held a raw honesty. "I've made mistakes in my life," James began, looking directly at the jury. "I've taken wrong turns, trusted the wrong people, but I didn't do this. That night I was walking home, minding my own business when the cops stopped me. They didn't ask questions. They just decided I fit the profile." His voice cracked slightly as he continued. "I've been fighting my whole life to be seen as more than what people assume about me, but I'm exhausted. I just want the truth to matter." Eleanor's throat tightened as James took his seat again. His words lingered in the air. A plea not just for justice, but for humanity. She glanced at the jury, their faces a blend of emotions: doubt, empathy, and uncertainty. This was it. The truth was no longer confined to evidence or testimonies. It was a battle of conscience, a struggle against the weight of prejudice and presumption. Eleanor understood that her role wasn't simply to uphold the law. It was to interpret it in a manner that served true justice. The final day of the trial dawned heavy with anticipation. The closing arguments were presented with precision. The prosecutor relied on the circumstantial evidence, urging the jury to trust the system's process. Lisa, on the other hand, implored the jury to look beyond the surface, to consider the gaps in the case and the humanity of the man on trial. Eleanor listened intently, her expression neutral, but her mind racing. Her role was clear. She could not sway the jury, but she would have the final say if their verdict left room for interpretation. The burden of ensuring justice weighed heavily on her. The jury deliberated for hours. The courtroom emptied and refilled as people stretched their legs or whispered among themselves. James sat quietly, his hands tightly clasped before him. He had looked at Eleanor since the trial began, and she couldn't fault him. What could she possibly say to make any of this better? Finally, the bailiff announced that the jury had reached a verdict. The room fell silent as the foreperson stood, a piece of paper trembling in her hands. In the case of the state of Louisiana versus James Anderson, we find the defendant. The pause was unbearable. Not guilty. The room erupted in a mix of gasps, murmurs, and even a few cheers. Eleanor tapped her gavel to restore order. James's shoulders sagged as if a burden had been lifted, but his expression remained unreadable. He had won his freedom, but it was evident that this victory had come at a cost. Eleanor addressed the court, her voice steady. "The jury has spoken. Mr. Anderson, you are free to go. Court is adjourned." As the courtroom cleared, Eleanor lingered behind, watching James as he signed his release paperwork. For a moment, she thought he might leave without a word, but then he turned and approached her. The room was nearly empty now, just a few clerks tidying up and Margaret gathering files. James stopped a few feet from the bench, his expression cautious. "You don't owe me anything," he said quietly, "but I'd like to know, why didn't you say anything? You knew me." Eleanor felt her throat constrict, the words catching. "Because I couldn't. I had to remain impartial. If I had said something, it might have jeopardized the case." James studied her, his face a blend of hurt and understanding. "Fair," he echoed. "That's the thing, Eleanor. The world has never been fair, not for people like me." She nodded slowly, her gaze dropping to the polished wood of the bench. "You're right. I wish I had done more back then, and I wish I could do more now." James sighed, the tension in his posture easing slightly. "We were kids. We didn't know any better. But you know now, don't you?" "I do," Eleanor affirmed, her voice resolute. "And I'm sorry." James gave a slight nod and then turned, walking away with his back straight as he disappeared through the courthouse doors. Eleanor sat alone in the empty courtroom, the weight of his words pressing on her. She had upheld the law, but the trial had revealed a deeper truth. Justice wasn't merely about verdicts and evidence. It was about the lives shaped by systems far larger than any one individual. For Eleanor, it was a wake-up call, a reminder that her position wasn't just a seat of power, but a platform for change. As she left the courtroom that evening, the fading sun casting long shadows across the courthouse steps, Eleanor made a silent vow. She couldn't change the past, but she would do everything within her power to ensure the future held more than empty promises of fairness. It would be difficult, perhaps even impossible, but she owed it to James and to herself to try.